Remember that your first 10,000 photographs are your worst. Becomes a photographer needs a very long process. And remember this word, practice makes perfect. Many people think that photography is just clicking the shutter button, then boom, magic things happen. So here I'm Theo Mahatmana, a wedding and state photographer, gladly going to be talking to you about the exposure triangle. Does anyone know about the exposure triangle? According to Nauberger and Lawrence, in the book Introduction of Digital Photography, the exposure triangle is the relationship between the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. It's the foundation for everything about photography. Once you understand how the exposure triangle works, you are going to be able to make sure you get great exposure. And when we think about exposure, a lot of the time we think about images are being too bright or too dark, but there is more to it than that. We can have images that are noisy or blurry, images that have a lot of stuff in focus or just the one thing that focuses. Or maybe it's totally out of focus. And the exposure triangle help us understand how all of that works together. The exposure triangle is made of three things, and these three things never change. So once you have this down, you are going to be good to go forever. And so don't fret. It's very simple. The aperture, the shutter speed, and ISO. The three things work together to give us a perfect exposure. Alright, I want to start to explain this by looking at the aperture. Here's a video for you. The aperture is inside your camera lens, and it's like a gate in the tunnel, and the aperture controls the quantity of light coming through into our camera. If I take this lens off and we can look at this close, I can move this. You can see it clearly that the aperture is just this thing that lets light coming through. It's growing and shrinking. I can make it really big or small by changing the aperture value. Now aperture value have number like f20, 22, f11, f5.6, f1.4, and the smaller the number means the larger the opening, and the smaller opening means a larger number. It seems like backward. It is and it's f1.4. It's really big, and now it's important to remember a big opening means a lot of light is coming through, and small opening means not very much light is coming through. So we have got a big number, not very much light, because it's a very small hole. A small number means a lot of light coming through because it is a big opening. Now look at this image. It shows how every single aperture value take effect on image. Look at the f1.4. It's very large aperture. It makes the image has the brightest light because it allows a lot of light coming through the camera, and it will make your image has very small depth of field. Means that you will have a blurry background behind the main subject in focus. The f1.4 until f5.6 usually used in portrait photography because in portrait photography we don't need a large depth of field. We need to pop up our model by making the background blurry, or we can call it bokeh. Then try to look at the f22. It's very small aperture. Means that small amount of light coming through the sensor of your camera, and it will make your image darker, but you will get a very wide depth of field. All object is in focus from the front until the end. f5.6 until f22 is better used in landscape photography, because in landscape photography you don't need bokeh image, but you need all object is in focus. The next thing in exposure triangle, it's called shutter speed. Shutter speed is the duration of the time that the shutter is open. Now the shutter can go at really fast speed like this. It's about f22 of a second, and then can go down about 80 of a second, and it's about 30 of second, and I can get slower half a second, and 1 second down to 3 seconds, even a few minutes. So just like the aperture, where it allow of light and not very much light, the shutter does sort of the same thing. With the really fast shutter, not very much light is coming into our camera. Slow shutter, a lot of light is coming into our camera. So we have got this two things: the aperture that can let in a lot of light or not very much light, and the shutter that can let in a lot of light or not very much light. And those two things have to be balanced on sort of like a scale. So if the aperture is letting in a lot of light, well, then this one needs to restrict so we don't get too much light. Then if the shutter is letting in a lot of light, then the aperture needs to set the smallest open. Okay, now look at this picture. This picture shows how the shutter takes effect on your image. With the shutter, you can freeze the motion or meta motion. The more you freeze the motion, the more you will get a darker image. So you need to make the aperture wider to catch enough light. And just what I said before, remember that in exposure triangle there are three things, and so don't forget this one. It's called ISO. An ISO controls the sensitivity of our camera to light, like our eyes in a dark area. At first we can see, but as our eyes adjust to the darkness, then we can see just fine. We can, but we can't see as well as we can in bright daylight. The same thing is true of ISO. When you have a low ISO, the number like 100 or 200, our camera is not very sensitive to light, and so we have to either open up our aperture really wide, or make a slow shutter speed, or increase our ISO, so our camera becomes more and more sensitive to light. The problem is also we get noise in our image, so there is a penalty for having high ISO. According to Nikon on its official website, in digital camera, raising the ISO means a similar decrease in quality. Now try to have to look at this picture. By increasing the ISO, you will get the brighter image, but also the image becomes sharpless, and we get a lot of grain or noise in our camera. So we have those three things: the aperture, more and less light; the shutter, more and less light; and the ISO, more and less sensitive to light, which is sort of the same thing as more or less light. Now the question is, which one do I start with? To I set the aperture, or I set the shutter speed? Well, it depends on photographer kind of photographer you are. Landscape photographer and portrait photographer are more concerned with the aperture than with their shutter, and the reason for that is the aperture help us control how much of an image is in focus, and in landscape photographer want everything in focus from the front and until the end, and so they want a small aperture value, and the shutter can do whatever it want to do because the camera is usually on a tripod. And in portrait photographer want to sort of the opposite of that. They want a nice clear image if somebody's face, but they want the background to fall out of focus, and the aperture help us to tune that. So landscape and portrait photographer care about the aperture, while the people that deal with motion, specifically in sport photographer and state photographer, they care about the shutter, because the shutter controls motion, and it either freeze motion or slow motion, because the shutter controls the duration of time, how long light come into our camera. So if you want to shot somebody dunking a basketball or attraction in concert, you need to set the shutter speed as a priority, then the other thing adjusted. And this is the last thing to end my entire speech, that I want to tell you about the way you balance the light. First, you need to know what type of photography you want. If you want to shot a portrait, you need to set your aperture first in the wide open at f1.8 until 5.6. After this, you can see the light matter in your camera. If it's show negative number, it mean you will have darker image. So you need to make the shutter slower and increasing the ISO until the light matter show balanced number, not plus or minus. So in conclusion, it is important to make your image has a balanced exposure. Even though you have the software to edit your work, a real photographer know how to shot properly even without software help. And what I have shared with you, it will be work if you practice and do it intensively. And remember the word that practice makes perfect, and remember that your 10,000 photographs are yours. So keep it up and try the best. Thank you.